straying.
Yeah, we are straying. We are diving in. We have an hour and 22 minutes. Okay.
Let's make the most
All
of
right,
it.
let's make the most of it. Here we go. This is kind of that. This is a football speech. Everybody knows what that is. You know, the whole going back to the basics. Question types. There's only so many types of questions. Sorry, I'm taking Darren's slide. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
Okay.
go ahead.
So there's 3-point values. You have directs, two parts, multiples, quotations, and cross references. And then obviously there's some mixing in there, but that's it. And if you have an understanding of each type and you go one by one, 10-point directs, 10.2 parts, 10-point quotations. Let's learn these. Let's get comfortable. Let's master this type of question. Then and see patterns, see tendencies. That's how, if we can do that ourselves, how can we teach our kids if we don't understand it ourselves? We have to understand these questions and understand the pieces to the puzzle. All right.
Yeah.
You
And
ready?
I think that another huge key to that is that when you understand that people think, you know, they hear like Philip, for example, say, I wrote 1,152 questions so far this year. And I don't know, I'm just throwing that number out there. It's probably close.
Yeah, actually, it's
1,152
pretty close,
questions so far this year. You think, wow, there's 1,150 questions. I got to try to remember. No, you can eliminate 80% of those just from the type of question that it is. You can eliminate another 18% of those from knowing where the verse is. There's only so many questions you can write from any given verse. And once you hear quizzes over and over and over again, you begin to understand what those questions are. And so going back to that pieces of the puzzle, even just from understanding what type of question it is, you have given yourself a piece of the puzzle. You just have to understand what you've got and how to use it.
So usually in practice, what I do is I'll read the question type. I'll be like, this question is a 20-point question, ready question. And I'll pause and I'll say, okay, what do we know right now?
Exactly. Same thing.
What do we know? And they say, and I'm like, we know it's one part. It's going to have one question word. It's going to have one answer, and it's going to have some length to it or complexity, right? We know all that right now. We haven't heard a word of the question. We only know the type. We know we know something. Okay. Well, if it's same thing, quotation, cross-reference, 4-part, what do we know?
And
we know
what
something.
you know at that point can influence how you behave in that question going forward. For example, if it's a quotation completion question, I mean, this is sort of an easy example, but you know everything you need to know right there. Get up on your seat and go. I tell the quizzers I coach, if you hear the words quotation completion from sitting behind you, I want to see you physically come to attention. I want to be able to discern from behind you that you understood what just happened and you are physically ready, because you don't need anything else.
Yeah.
Quotation complete. You've got everything you need to know, right?
But the thing is that that's an easy concept.
Yeah.
That's every question type, and it can change depending on the question writer. Like if we're preparing for BQE and I'm going through the BQE prep set, and I see that basically it's impossible to interrupt 3 parts until you have the first two parts of the question because of the way they're written, then I need my kids to know with this question writer, if you hear 3-part, you need to say, chill out. We got to get 2 parts. We got to be patient. We got to hit the right spot. Or if you know on this question writer that all of his directs, most of them you can be very aggressive on, and they hear direct, you don't hear direct, but
especially 10 pointers. And this
Yeah.
is one thing, the very first question that we go through will point this out. And Philip and I kind of go back and forth on this and may not agree 100%, but what I always tell our quizzers is, because I find from my personal perspective that the percentages play out in my favor this way. If it's a 10-point direct question and it starts with a question word, hit it.
So that's a good segue. Here we go. We're going to start with some 10-point directs. First one, this style, of course. So there's only a few ways you can write a 10-point question. This one in particular, what do we see? Verse 13 of Mark chapter 14. Okay. Verse reference at the beginning. Is the verse reference necessary? No. Is the verse reference always going to be at the beginning of the question? No, it is not. Verse 13 of Mark chapter 13 refers to a man. If you see down the yellow part, I kind of marked where I would want my kids to hit.
Mm-hmm.
Refers to a man. There's a couple ways it could go. So if we hit there, refers to a man. They should get that much information.
Or
refers to a
something that
they should be able to locate in the verse where that is. Refers to a man. Okay, what do we see? And there shall meet you a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him. So we know where in the verse, we have the verse reference. We have enough of a keyword to know where in the verse we are. We know it's a one-part question. We have a lot of pieces to the puzzle, right? Those are all pieces of the puzzle. Now we have to think of what we have left. A man bearing a pitcher of water, follow him. So refers to a man bearing a pitcher of water, do what? Does that make sense?
Doesn't make any sense.
Doesn't make any sense. Refers to a man bearing a pitcher of what? Maybe, but that's kind of
But see, here's where it goes to knowing your grammar, right? Because then that what is not necessarily an object. It's an object of the preposition. Probably not going to be what it is.
right.
Because that picture of is sort of really a whole thing contained within itself. That prepositional, that whole phrase there. It's a pitcher of water. It's not just pitcher of what. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
it doesn't make as much sense that way.
Usually what I say to my kids when if they were to make a question like refers to a man bearing a pitcher of what, I would say, okay, if that was the question, would it be written that way? Or would it be a pitcher of what is mentioned? You know, it would be, it wouldn't be refers to a man bearing a pitcher of what? Like there's a reason that the question is led into and written that way. So refers to a man doing
So
what?
well, I was going to say, there's really only two ways at the end of the day, when you process through all these, that makes sense to ask this question. A man doing what? A man bearing what? And you answer that by knowing your question writer.
Right. And that's a verb flip. One, the verb's in the answer, one, the verb's in the question. This is a question writer tendency. Typically, most question writers in the 10 pointers, verbs are in the question.
Yep.
For the most part.
No. Yeah.
So if you were to say a man doing what, that could also make you ambiguous. Right. Right. And,
Yeah.
And
exactly.
he sent forth to his, yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. He's saying it would make it ambiguous to say a man doing what, because Jesus is also doing something in this verse. That's a really good
It would
point.
make it contestable.
Yeah, it would make it very contestable. So in that case, I mean, it really is truly only one way that this can go. All right. We're going to fly through these as much as we can. So this is the type that he was referring to. The first word in this 10-point direct question is a question word. This is not always the case. And I somewhat disagree with him that if I hear that the first word on a 10-point direct is a question word, I'm hitting. I'm not so much so, but what ointment? I mean, what do you need more than that? Ointment is a one-time word. What ointment? You don't need anything else. And even though it says is described, that doesn't mean you have to say is described. You can say is mentioned, is spoken of, is referred to. All that doesn't matter because that's essence, is referred to. And you can say in a verse of study because
it's a one-time word.
It's a one-time word. It's unique. You don't have to narrow it down to the verse, even though in this case it is. Okay.
And here's a good example of the pronoun thing we were talking about earlier, right? What ointment? Well, if you say an ointment of spikenard, very precious, and she break the box and poured it on his head, do you have to identify those if you narrow it down to that verse?
No, because
it's not essential.
It's not essential to the answer.
Question.
Correct. Yep. Okay. So once again, we're just showing different styles. Look, verse reference at the beginning, question word at the beginning. How do we handle these different things? Judas Iscariot went unto the chief priests. Why? Okay. First of all, this answer has a pronoun, so that's good to notice here. But why isn't it Judas Iscariot went unto whom? And that's a perfectly fine question. There's nothing wrong with saying Judas Iscariot went unto whom. There's nothing wrong with that question. But the thing is, there's a why there, right there, to betray him unto Jesus. And what I'd say, that's kind of like a question writer treat. Like they see that and they're like, "Ooh, I want to write that."
Eyes light up.
Yeah, your eyes like, "Oh, I get to write a why. Yay." Okay. So if you had, what I say on these 10-point questions, if the length of the why or the how or the when makes sense, if it's not super long, if the length of the answer makes sense, go with the why, the how, or the when more than the basic Judas Iscariot went unto whom, right?
Yeah. So another thing I would point out here too is if you hit Judas Iscariot went, you might think it could also be where, but typically a where is going to be a place. Not, and unto somebody or something or unto the mount, right? Typically, again, you can see this from question writer tendencies, but typically the where is going to be went to Jerusalem or went to Damascus or went to the mountain, not went to a group of people.
Yeah. But then, once again, you have to ask yourself, if that's the question, why was it written this way?
Yeah.
And a lot of whys, a lot of whens are on the end of the question where it leads up the opposite. What's opposite of a why? The lead up to the why, it's read out, and then you have that why. So notice whys. Kids need to be ready for whys. To betray him, referring to Jesus, unto them. So if you see, the references has Mark 14:6 and Mark 14:10. So I believe this question is out of Mark 14:10. Jesus was specified in Mark 14:6. So this question was left open to the chapter. So we have to specify to betray him unto Jesus. That's something we want to make sure that we know who him is. And there's nothing wrong, I would say, to betray Jesus unto them. And why isn't them? Why don't you need to specify them? Because chief priest is in the question. That is why you need to specify him and not them. Okay, hope everybody's clear. All right. How did the disciples address Jesus? This is one that I put this in here because I wanted to make a point of this. I noticed in state finals last year that Brother Faubert liked address questions. How did so-and-so address so-and-so? Okay. I don't think there's going to be a lot of that in Proverbs, so this really can't help for this year. But what did I notice? I said, hey, I saw him write a couple of these, which are kind of unique, right? How many times does someone address someone else as something? You have master, you have children, you have Lord, you have all these different addresses, rabbi, all these different things. There's only so many of them. So what do? What did I do? I charted them out. I found every single address and I put it in a spreadsheet, and I said who was addressing who, and I was able to sort. Okay, there was only one verse in which the disciples addressed anyone as anything. Okay, and I knew that because I charted it out. And guess what? There's only one time the disciples addressed anyone as anything. And guess what? There's only one verse in which Jesus addressed the disciples as something. And lo and behold, we get that question in nationals because my kids heard that question. Sorry, my daughter said something funny. So this is the kind of thing where you can say that question's hard to interrupt quickly unless we do this. And if we study this out, we can figure this out and we can be ready for any of these or most of these, right? Like we can get a little advantage here and be ready for these.
And what that 2 interruption points there is just showing you the difference in where you can interrupt this by knowing that and not knowing that.
Right.
That's the question.
If you charted it out and if you've looked at your addresses, and as long as in most of the material there and something like that, there's not an unbearable amount. There's probably 15 to 20 that you need to study. Is that too much for a quizzer? Just go through their addresses and just notice, oh, there's only one of these, there's only one of these, there's only one. Okay, there's 2 of these, but this one, there's only one in this chapter, one in this chapter. Oh, and look at this. Jesus addressed John as this in this chapter, and he addressed John as this in this chapter. That's a good cross-reference question. You write that cross-reference. And one of my favorite was when I charted, I noticed Jesus addressed Peter as Simon in one verse, and he addressed Peter as Satan in another verse. That's a really cool cross-reference, is it not? It is that pretty hard to interrupt on if you've never heard that before. Maybe a little bit. It's kind of tough. But if you made that question, if you wrote that question, that is the times, you see quizzers just crush a question and everybody's like, like, how did they do that? It's because they've heard that question before, whether it was in their own head, where they wrote in their own head.
They understand the logic of why it is the highest percentage option.
Right. Anyway, that's what I wanted to point out about this is the type of question that we can notice and be like, we can chart this out and figure and give us an advantage here. Otherwise, if you hadn't charted out how the disciples addressed Jesus in verse 38, if that's where you hit, that's where that cross quoting kind of comes in, and you need to cycle through all your verse 38s, right? There's only so many 38s. 38 is kind of a higher verse number. There's not going to be too many. You should be able to cycle through them and find a verse that had the disciples in it and Jesus, and you should be able to get. There's no reason you should hit past that verse 38. No reason. You don't need the chapter. If you know your stuff, you can go through your verse 38s and find that. All right. Among the tombs, a man with an unclean spirit had what? So this is kind of an interesting one. This is the one where he could do it two ways. He could say, according to Mark chapter 5, verse 3, a man with an unclean spirit had what? But he didn't write it that way. What did he do? He took a unique phrase, among the tombs. That is a unique phrase. There's only one verse that has the phrase among the tombs. So what is that doing? That's saying, hey, not only am I telling you what verses is from, I'm telling you, I'm giving you a piece of the puzzle. It's basically like a double piece. The question is going to have something to do with among the tomb. It's going to be wrapped around this piece of information, because remember, the questions have to make sense, right? They had to make grammatical sense. It's not going to be among the tombs. A man with an unclean spirit had his dwelling, and no man could do what?
Not for a 10-point question.
Right. It's among the tombs. It's gonna have something to do with the question, right? So he's telling you what verse it's in, and he's telling you the question is in this vicinity, is going to be wrapped in this area. So among the tombs, you could go to who had his dwelling.
Yeah, a couple different ways. Really, only a couple different ways that you can go with this question here. And either way, hitting where you hit, you get what you need. If it goes the way a man with an unclean spirit had what, which is the way the question is written, you got what you need. If it goes among the tombs, who had his dwelling, hitting in that same spot, you still have what you need.
You should get who. So if you hit among the tombs and you hit, you should get who, or you should get a man. And then if you get either one of those, there's only one
where to go. And so again, if you put this question down on paper and you say mark where you should interrupt it, a lot of people are going to mark after among the tombs a man, because they're even good interrupters are going to say, okay, this is what I need to know where it's going. Well, it's really not, because it can only go one of two ways, and all you need is just something to point you which way it is by the time you get to there. Because like Philip said, you've already got the where, you already know where you're at, you already know what the question's built around, you already know what kind of question you're looking for, you know the point value, so you know the relative length and simplicity of the question. All of those pieces of the puzzle you already know. All you need at that point is, which way is it going? I got two choices. Which one is it? And that's the last point at which you can hit that and get that last piece of information.
Okay. That's all our 10-point directs. Easiest kind of question we deal with, right? But there's actually a lot of meat in there. There's a lot of key things that we can take from 10-point directs when we notice there's not many more ways to write a 10-point direct question than all those I show you. There are some, sure, but the majority of 10-point questions are going to be give you a phrase that helps you locate it and tells you what the question is going to be about. This one I just kind of threw in there. It will how the disciples addressed. That's kind of a charting type question. Then you have a drawn out why. You have a question word as the first word in the question. You have the verse reference at the beginning. There's only so many ways you can write these. So if we prepare and get ready for them, and get our kids ready for them, we can be aggressive and be confident, not only in our material, hopefully, but we can be confident that we understand that if we get enough pieces of the puzzle, we have a great shot at figuring out what it's a picture of.
And how do you do that? Read them the questions. That's it. This is what we talked about earlier in practices. Take some time, devote to these specific type questions, these point value questions. Spend some time on it.
Right. And I like to say, like we're doing right now, just take one question type. And if I know, I have a quizzer that I need to rely on for the end of the quiz. I need this kid to get a lot of 20s and 30s, and I need this kid to get a lot of 10s. What am I going to do? I'm going to say, hey, you kid, I need you to be the best 10-point quizzer in the country. You know what we're going to do? We're going to work on 10s, and you're going to master 10s. Do you want to do that? You brought in, you buy in, you help that kid master these questions. You help that kid master 10-point direct questions. and to see different patterns, see different ways that things can go. Then once you get 10-point directs, you move on to 2 parts. You move on to quotations, take it one by one. All right. Darren, you want to do this next one? So we're moving on to 10.2 part questions.
Yeah. So the one thing to notice here is what? What's the first thing you notice when you see this question? I'll answer. First thing I notice is the emphasis, right? So you see where we've hit in this question. Verse says, and he arose from thence and cometh into the coasts of Judea by the farther side of Jordan, and the people resort unto him again. And as he was wont, he taught them again. Question, 2-part. Again, what do we know already? 2-part, 10-point. We're looking for something that's going to be built around verbs or prepositions. Most of the time, that's what you're looking for, right? Those 2 things, knowing your grammar. I'm looking for either 2 verbs or 2 prepositional phrases that are going to give me a simple question in this 10-point question.
Patterns. We're looking for a pattern.
So question here, the first verse of Mark chapter 10 mentions the coasts.
You don't need any
That's
more
all I
than
need.
that.
I've got the emphasis. I know which word is going to change. So in order to get that, that's not where I hit. That's reaction quizzing. I want to anticipate what I need, not react to what I need. So I see that coming with the phrase mentions. It's that trigger word. That tells me that it's coming now. What I need is coming. With that mentions the coasts.
Because you have the verse reference, the first verse of Mark chapter 10. So I mean, there's only so many 2-part questions that even make sense in the first verse of Mark chapter 10. So not only you know what verse it's in, only so many 10.2 parts you can make that make any sense. You know you're about to get a keyword or something.
Trigger word. That's what you've got.
You're about to get something key. So if this was mentions the coasts and there was no emphasis on it, it could, then we need to kind of figure out it's not going to be the coast of where, the farther side of where, it's going to be something else. So maybe the question word would be emphasized. We have to consider that, look for 2 different question words. But in this case, the coasts of where and the farther side of where. Now, some people may have the question, what if you say the coast of what and the farther side of what? Is that the same? And the answer is, I think it's the same.
He thinks it's the same. I think it's subjective.
I think that is in essence saying the coast of what? Judea, far side of what? Jordan. I think in essence the answers are the same, and there's nothing wrong with changing those wheres to whats. Obviously, you can't change them to wins.
That's kind of thing that you look for in the points of interpretation. A lot of times that'll be identified there. It will help you understand those things. And when you're sitting at BQE and Brother Fulbright says, okay, does anybody have any questions? Ask it.
Yes.
Ask it.
Or email him.
Yeah.
I mean, he's kind of a busy guy, but he answers eventually. And that's another thing. Just knowing it's a 10.2 part question, guess what? There's 2 geographical locations in this verse. Judea, Jordan. Patterns, right? 2-part, 2 geographical locations. It's just little things that there's only so many ways. There's only so many 10-point questions. That's why you should be able to tell your kid on a verse like this, it's like, hey, give me a 10.2 part question. And within 2 or 3 tries, they should make this question. Because it's an obvious 2-part right there. All right. Enough of that. What was hewn out of what? Okay, what is the word hewn? The word hewn is a unique one-time key word. Do we need anything more than what was hewn to know what verse this is?
Takes you where you need to go. It tells you where you are.
That word hewn should immediately take the quizzers to where it goes. So, and you already have one of the question words, and you already have a keyword. Okay, you don't even need the reference. We don't need that piece of the puzzle. We have that piece of the puzzle because it's a keyword and it's unique. So we know what verse it's in. We have one of the question word is the what. We have no emphasis. Okay, so that means it's not some sort of pattern that's changing. It's not going to be, if it was what was hewn, then you're looking for what was hewn and what was, what'd you say? Wrapped. Yeah, wrapped. Yeah, there you go. And who was wrapped, something like that. So in this case, what was hewn? What comes after the word hewn? A sepulcher which was hewn out of a rock. Is rock a good answer to a 10-point question? It's a pretty solid answer. I always think like, you have to think about, is that a good answer to a question? Rock. Yeah, it's a good answer. There you go. Anything else to say about this one? Pretty obvious. All right. Next.
Other than if you notice, if you hit rule out soon after that first word, you're going to get what you need.
Two-part. Referring to a man with an unclean spirit. This is one of those questions we were talking about. What do we know already? It's a two-part question. There's going to be a pronoun coming up in the question that is referring to a man with an unclean spirit. And we see that what had been plugged asunder by him and what broken in pieces. Okay, so why did they write it that way? They wrote it that way because it's a lot better than what had been plugged asunder by a man with an unclean spirit and what broken in pieces, right? That's just kind of, that's clunky. What did that do? Not only do we specify who that him is for context purposes, but it just gave us a sharper clarification on where it's going to come out of. Okay. Referring to a man with unclean spirit in Mark chapter 5, what had been, even just that, what had been, we know it has to do with a man with an unclean spirit. What in chapter 5? So how many verses talk about a man with an unclean spirit in Mark chapter 5? I mean, there's only a few. It's not the entire chapter, right? So not only we already, if you just hit there, what had been, the quizzer's command, I guarantee you had been is a unique phrase in Mark chapter 5. I mean, I don't want
Yeah, and I would even argue that you could even hit it after the verse reference or after the chapter reference here, potentially. Again, depending on how much risk you're wanting to take or needing to take. In the tens, I could think you could get away with being a little more risky. And this is just a philosophical approach, right? How do you want to approach the quiz? Do you want to be a little more aggressive? Do you not want to be a little more aggressive? In this situation, this lines up perfectly for the what question. I mean, it's just laid out there for you. This is by far the most logical two-part question in this verse. So really, all you need is referring to a man with an unclean spirit in Mark chapter 5, what had, and that what had is likely going to be enough to get them to the right portion of scripture if they have a true material command of the few places in Mark 5 where it's actually talking about him. Again, it's a percentage thing, and it's a decision as a coach, as a team you make. And it just goes to how you want to approach that quiz. But I would even make an argument you could even do it a little sooner if you wanted to.
Okay. Moving on, another two-part. To repentance. What is this? We kind of talked about it earlier. This is getting that unique phrase at the beginning of the question. The question is going to have to do with that phrase, and that phrase is telling you what verse it's in. So, to repentance, we should be able to know what verse is coming out of, and know what part of the verse it's going to be about. So I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. We should be able to locate it and know the questions coming out of this section right here. It's not going to come out of the whole first part of the verse. When Jesus heard it, he saith unto them, they that are all of no need of physician, but they that are sick. The question is going to be wrapped around the part with the to repentance, which is why it's at the beginning of the question. So to repentance. Okay, so you could write it this way. I came not to call whom, but whom to repentance. You could write it that way, right? Or you could take that to repentance that's unique, throw it at the beginning and say, hey, quizzers, this is where it's coming from. All you really need is this to make this two-part. Does that make sense? I hate that everyone's online and a lot of nodding. Good, thank you. I wish we could see all your faces. Thank you for everyone that's online, and we do really appreciate all of you taking this day. I know this is like a whole day thing, but thank you for wanting to better yourself as coaches for our kids, because that's why we're doing this. We want to help coaches coach kids. So if I want to take just a moment real quick, I know of so many kids that are so God gifted and talented, and that unfortunately don't have a coach with experience and knowledge, and don't really know where to go to help themselves get that experience and knowledge. And it breaks my heart to see kids with so much potential that aren't able to be coached. And Darren and I have talked a lot about this, and we're passionate about equipping coaches as much as we can, because we want kids to be able to live up to their potential. So that's why we're doing this. And I want to thank all of you for participating.
Amen. A couple of things I want to point out about this question real quick.
Okay.
There is another way this question could go, but there's a couple reasons why I think it's not the right way for it to go. You could ask, to repentance, Jesus came not to do what, but what, or came to do what, but not what. But it doesn't really make sense, right? It doesn't flow very well. It doesn't fit the point perspective of the question. Another thing is
But-
it shares the verb.
Right.
It's not building off two verbs or it's sharing a verb, right? And so, yeah, it's possible. Yeah, a question writer could do it, but it's not the highest percent. And this is a far higher percentage to go with what we've gone with.
It also doesn't really make sense because the do what and do not what should include to repentance because that's part of what is being done.
That's what I mean. It doesn't really. I'm just saying it's not always 100% cut and dry situation. And if you're waiting to the point to interrupt where you have that, you're going too slow.
Okay. Jesus commanded the 12 to be shod with what and not put on what? Can someone tell me what the word with is? It's a preposition. So what is this? This style pattern. This is a preposition pattern. Your kids should be able to hear this question and be like, oh, look, that's a preposition pattern. Cool. Like they should know that. Well, and we have to know it first. Honestly, if it wasn't for Bible quizzing, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you what a preposition is. So I'm not gonna be high and mighty over here if not everyone is comfortable with grammar, because I am an example. So Jesus commanded the 12. That is not in this verse, right? Jesus commanded the 12. That's not in the verse. That's the whole verse right there underneath it. But be shod with sandals and not put on two coats.
See why it's important to know context and content, and comprehend things that are not just tied to a verse reference. You got no idea where to even to begin to go if you don't know who's talking to who right here.
So if you don't get shod, which is a unique word, all you need is shod. That just shows you hit before shod, you're toast. You hit after shod, there's only one way it could be.
Well, you get shot or not hit before shot.
Well, right. As long as you get the word shod.
Yeah.
So that just shows you that it can be, one word, one syllable can change the difference from 0% to 100%, or it should be 100%.
I would even argue that you could hit in the space between be and shod.
Right.
And you're going to get sh, and that is going to be enough to get you what you need to. Most of the time, if you have a quizzer that has a very good command of their material.
So it's just important to notice where in the biggest thing I want you guys to take out of this is figuring out where the earliest spot your kids should be hitting and why they should be hitting there, and being able to express to them, this is where you need to hit. This is where you have enough pieces to the puzzle.
And helping them see that, right? Because it's a process. What they're doing is they're working through these progressions. They're sort of analyzing their way through these progressions, just like we're talking about here, but they're having to do it in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 seconds with the whole world watching and the clock ticking, right?
It's really easy to be an armchair coach.
Yeah.
Right.
So what we have to do is you just have to do this so much that it becomes inherent. It becomes a part of their brain process. We're training their brains to do this kind of stuff. And you say, well, you can't, they're never going to. Yes, they will. I mean, we both had quizzers. By the time they get to that age where they're cognitively able to do it at a high level, they have been trained to do it that way, and it becomes inherent almost.
And that is important. I mean, the difference between a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old is vast at a cognitive level. I mean, there's just some things that they're not going to be able to do yet. But what you can do is lay building blocks when they're 13.
Exactly right.
So when they are 16, they can make that jump, or slowly. For coaches that were quizzers years ago, the new buzzer system has a much more significant delay between when you hit and when it sounds. Okay. Yeah. He said, that there is a difference between the old slap buzzards, which I know some people are very fond of. And, even the wooden handle ones.
No.
Correct. Yeah. Even the wood handle ones. Right. Right. If you, right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what
There,
and that's
most
one
of the time there
things-
is a slightly more delay
That's one of the
between the
things
old
that I
verses.
preach to quizzers that I coach is not very more often than not, you're hitting in a space or in a pause or at a comma and not necessarily at a word because you're doing it in anticipation of what's coming. And that's to your point, what you're talking about right there.
All right, we're gonna keep going. Two-part, referring to Simon and Andrew in Mark chapter 1. Wow, we just got a lot of information right there. Not only do we get the chapter, we got referring to Simon and Andrew. So there's going to be a pronoun in this question that's probably also in the verse that is referring to Simon and Andrew. We already know all of that.
So again, as a quizzer, the first thing I'm doing is, I think one of the big mistakes quizzers make is they start looking for verses that name Simon and Andrew. No, as a quizzer right here, the first thing I'm doing is looking for a verse that refers to them but does not name them. It's not always that way, but the percentages are that it will be because it starts referring to.
So once you get they forsook, we know who they is. So it's and Simon and Andrew forsook. Okay, be able to go to that verse. They forsook what? What's significant about the word what in this question?
I believe it's emphasized,
It
Philip.
is emphasized. What does that mean?
That means the next time you ask a question in that pattern, that word is going to change.
Yeah, it means we're going to have a different question word in the second question. It's going to be different from they forsook what and follow whom. Okay, that is what I wanted. That kids need to be able to, when they get an emphasized question word, they need to know what that means. They need to know what it means when they get a referring to.
And again, I would even argue, because really in my mind, there's only another way that this question could go. If you hit after the word they, you hit in that space between they and forsook, you're going to get forsook.
Yeah.
The only other thing that really could be is they did how many things and what are they?
Really what I wanted.
And you're going to get that either way.
Right. All right. We are done with 10.2 parts.
Does anybody need 5 minutes to freshen?
Anybody want a quick break?
Okay.
Everybody good?
I'm good if you're good.
I think we're going to roll till
At
4.
home, we're going on.
Yeah, we're going on. Okay. Okay, thumbs up. We're almost through this. I know this is a long day, and I'm so thankful that you guys are staying
So
with us.
thankful.
All right. So I didn't split out 10, 20, 30-point quotations. I just did quotations because while there are differences, they share a lot of concepts between just the different point values. So sorry, this has 2 question numbers for some reason. That's my fault.
Question 14.10.
We know
Quotation question.
We know the point value based on the question number. This is a 20-point quotation question. Okay. If you don't know if it's between 9 and 17.
Or if it's 10,
it's
it's still a 20-point quotation question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Either way. Yes.
14, 10 doesn't matter.
I'm just saying I didn't say if it's a 10 or a 20. We just need to know by the question number. Okay. So this is a super straightforward quotation question. It's right there at the beginning. Abba Father. This is a
reaction question.
Reaction question. This is one of those where you are waiting to see if it's at the beginning, if it's there, if it's that key piece of information, which sometimes the quiz master, how they're reading it, like we've talked about a lot, can kind of tell you if it's that or not. And you just had to kind of notice little things like that. Yeah. Abba Father, does a quizzer need any more than that? Quizzers should never hit. They don't need quote the verse. Like, and I'm not saying that my kids don't do it. I have kids that do it, and it's getting them to that point. Or just making them be reactionary and make them like they have to get to the point where you need to convince them you don't need that. You already know it. Why do you need to hear it come out of their mouth? All you need to be able to say it.
So one of the things about quotation questions, and Philip talks about this a little bit, is that there are basically 3 kinds of quotation questions. You either get it at the beginning, the middle, or the end. I even kind of make it a little simpler than that when I'm talking to my quizzers. It's really just 2 for me, and the way that I teach them, it's 2 types, and it's either at the front or it's not.
That's a good way.
You know what I'm saying? It's either the first thing out of his mouth or it isn't. And so you have to be, again, when I hear the word quotation question, I want to physically see that you are up ready, because it's going to be either how fast can you react to what you've heard, or how well can you anticipate once you determine that it's not reaction?
Yeah, I had a quizzer, and I just Sherwin. If those of you that know Sherwin, where he had a tendency where, and this is kind of goes to just coaching your team and to trying to play to your strengths, where he would just kept getting burned. A verse of study, quote the verse, and he was just anticipating too much, and he would just kept getting burned. So what did he do? He literally just took his thumb off of the buzzer. And if it was quote the verse, or if it was a single verse, and he heard that, then he would put his thumb back on the buzzer, and he'd be ready to hit at that reactionary anticipatory spot, because he was just getting burned too much. But you know who was good at it? Avery was great at getting the ones that were right there at the beginning. So that's where your teamwork comes into play, and he had the humility to say, you know what? I'm getting burned on these a lot. He's really good at this. So I'm gonna do what's best for the team, and I'm gonna just take myself out of this style of quotation question. And if it ends up it's not that, I'm gonna jump back in.
Because really the only other way this question can be written, right, is quote the verse containing the phrase Abba Father. And as soon as you hear the Abba Father is not at the front, your mind flips and it becomes now, okay, we're all just sitting here waiting. It's like the whole world slows down in Quizzer world, and it's all in slow motion, and everybody is just waiting to get to that point where they know it's a race, right?
And it's a skill that's really hard to teach. It just takes practice.
Exactly right.
And it's it's a skill because there's quizzers that generally win those types of battles.
Well, one of the things that I've done, and maybe you've done something this way too, is I'll take the same question and read it 10 times and mix it up. One time I'll put it at the beginning, one time I'll put it at the end, and make no pattern to it, just vary it, just to get them used to being ready to go, but being able to just in time not hit.
Yeah, and one thing that I did when the kids were younger, and I realized that I hadn't done this with another one of my kids that was younger than my boys, is like 1, 2, 3 go drills when they're young. Just 1
or colors,
2
or words of some kind.
3 go, and whoever hits first, and it just teaches that like anticipating. Or I would get the Bible, or I would get a book or something, and I would say, okay, the key word is table, and I would just start reading, and I would just read naturally until I said the word table, and I would even read past the word table, and whoever hit first would win.
So
and then
we just worked them on anticipation, which is 1, 2, 3 go, and you've worked them on reaction, which is I'm going to throw a word in here, you don't know when it's coming. Be ready for it.
But I did that a lot when my kids were younger.
King of the buzzer.
And then we kind of moved on from that, because we kind of moved on from that because they had kind of mastered it, and there wasn't any point to it anymore. But then I started coaching another kid that struggled with these quotation questions. And I'm just sitting there like, why in the world is she not good at these? I don't understand. And then I realized she never had that. We never had to, and she didn't have someone in her league and practice every week to sharpen her up. Like I was so blessed to have 2 boys that would just to sharpen each other every week. I mean, that's irreplaceable. But I had to go back to this experienced quizzer and have her doing 1, 2, 3 go in these drills again, because you have to practice that stuff. All right. Next,
I feel like we just said this.
We just said this.
Yeah.
This is just an example of the stuff's at the end. This is anticipating. Quote the question, naming. You hear naming, the next word is what you need. That's it. And this is also a unique one because it's quote the question. This is why we study our questions and our punctuation, because if they don't know where the question is, they're in trouble. You can't say, you have to quote this verbatim, the question. And
here's another thing. Even at BQE, it can sometimes be early enough in the material to where there aren't any other places you can get a 10-point quotation question where it names what question is naming somebody.
Right. Well, there's a
so
lot
if you know that, you have a little bit of an advantage.
But I try to make sure my kids they go through their questions. Even if it's like, okay, and if we're studying it and they're quoting their verses, or even if they're just quote naturally, and there's a verse like this that has multiple questions, I said, quote it. And when you get to a question mark, I want you to say question mark. And they And Joseph and of Judah and Simon, question mark, and are not his sisters here with us, question mark, and they are offended at him, period. It just, I want to make sure they know, and there's not so many verses that have punctuation, things like this. So when you come to one and your kids are quoting it, be like, hey, I want you to say the punctuation as you're quoting this verse. And if you just do that, it's just natural. They don't have to worry about it. They know it. Okay. Question. Yeah. If I was a quiz master and I'm coaching a kid. If that's the only verse of study that has a question that names anybody, and the kid picked the wrong name. Oh, right. And they picked the wrong name. No, I would not give it to them. That is a different question. And I know that's tough sometimes, but it stinks because we've all probably seen those times where the quizzer basically they said a question that had the exact same answer, but it's a different question. And that's part of it.
Now,
It's
one thing that I would teach them to do if they get in that situation, and it may work and it may not work. Sometimes subjectivity can be your friend. I would teach them to say, question naming Judah, James, and Peter. Say them all.
Oh, that's not a bad point.
I mean, that way you at least have a chance, right? You don't have to pick one. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
I think that's closer than
again, you're trying to use subjectivity in your favor as opposed to it working against you. Is it going to work? I don't know, but it's to me, it's better than 33% chance, which is the chance you got if there's 3 names in there and you're just picking one of them.
Okay, we're going to move on. Question number 14, 20-point quotation question. Quote the verse in which. Pay attention to in which. That's always, we're going to get more into that here in a little bit.
Something is coming.
Something's coming, or maybe something's coming that you don't want to hit on. So we're going to get more into that. Quote the verse in which a pitcher of water. So this is just, you had to anticipate it and jump on it as soon as you hear that keyword and feel that keyword coming. All right, quotation. These are fun. So I will tell a very short story. My team thankfully was very good at this style quotation question until one quiz at nationals this past year in which I had two fantastic quizzers all year. They did not miss a single one of these all year. And then the same quiz at nationals, both of them missed one of these by picking the wrong one, preceding, following. They never missed these until I was flabbergasted. All right. So this is a 10-point quotation. So that's very important to know on these. And then it just starts reading a verse. The quizmaster just literally starts at the beginning of a verse and starts reading. And that's the big key, because it's not, but Peter said unto him, quote the verse so it contains this phrase. No. And sometimes the beginning of a verse is like a unique phrase. But if you know that that's the beginning of the verse, then your kids need to know, okay, this verse is getting read all the way out, and then we had to pick the preceding or following. So basically, as soon as a quizzer recognizes that a verse is simply being read from the beginning, they need to jump on it, and then you have to figure out quote the verse preceding or quote the verse following based on length first. Length first. And if the lengths are the same, which in my opinion,
in Proverbs, you will get a lot of that.
Yeah, I don't write them anymore unless the length is obvious. I don't. That's me. But if the length is similar, then you teach your kids to go with context or flow. Which verse, is the next verse the why for this verse?
Or is it the answer to a question asked?
Or is it a continuation of the thought? Then you go with that. But
or is 90 it the same statement? Is it inside the same punctuation?
90% of the time, length. Length. And that's what my kids made the mistake of in that same quiz. They both went with the context and the thoughts as opposed to the length, because they felt like in that moment that the lengths were close enough that they need to go with the context. The lengths weren't, and the lengths were more obvious when I looked at it. And it's a lot easier looking at it on my phone and like looking at the links.
You
and
can like
saying,
see, oh, this
one's
one's
short."
1.5 lines long, and this one's 2.5 lines long.
Right. But
How did you not know that?
like obviously it's a lot easier when you're looking at it than when you're a quizzer, but that is the what they should gauge it off of. All right. The number 6. This is one of those where it's kind of difficult unless you really chart your numbers. Guess what? 6. You're like, man, 6. Where in the world is that? If you chart your numbers, there's only so many numbers. If you chart them all, this becomes easy. This is the point of charting to me. Charting makes difficult questions easy. Okay, that's the point of it. We've heard it before. We've made this question. There's only one verse that has the number 6. And if you hear the number, you're hitting, right? You're hitting because you know you're going to get what you need. You know you're going to get 6. Okay. Next, we have a 10-point quotation question. In the verse following the one that describes Simon and Andrew as fishers, quote what Jesus said. This is an interesting one. This is something that is much more akin to Gospels, to narrative studies, because a lot of spoken words. So what Faubert tended to do a lot this year is he wanted you to quote what someone said, especially in the 10s, right? So this is kind of an interesting one. In the verse following the one, so we have it. We know not only is it gonna, we're not gonna be quoting a whole verse. We're gonna be quoting part of a verse in the verse on a quotation. So we know that. In the verse following that describes Simon and Andrew as, how many verses describe Simon and Andrew as anything? That's another thing that you can chart out that is very difficult is descriptions. It's not fun, but you can do that. Or, you know, what's more fun is to make your quizzers do it. But, so even if you get the one that describes Simon and Andrew as, I mean, there's only so many ways that could go. But as soon as you get fishers, you should know what verse it's in. You should be able to think of the following verse. And then at that point, you have to quote part of the verse. In all contexts, in all situations, that's either going to be a punctuation style thing, quote the question, quote the statement, quote the exclamation, or quote what someone said.
Or what is written.
Or quote what is written. Yes. Those are pretty much the only things it's going to be. It's not going to be quote the whole verse because it said in the verse following. It's going to be part of that verse. Okay. Anything to add here? Mm-hmm. Okay. Quote the verse of Mark chapter 4, naming 4. If we hear that, guess what? That might be difficult unless we charted it out. And it was, hey, guess what? There's only one verse that names 4 people. Okay. Just became easy.
The other thing too, I would say here is this is a good example of being able to maybe bail yourself out if you hit where you think is too soon. I mean, if you say you interrupt after quote the verse of Mark chapter 1 naming, you still have a lot of information there. And if you think about it for a minute, you might be able to pull that out, right? You know that you're looking for proper nouns. You know you're looking for a verse in Mark chapter 1. What you then start looking for is what's unique, okay? Where is there something unique? Is there a verse that names only one person once or names only one lady once? Or is there something like this that names 4 different people? So you start looking for those unique places like that.
You also have the point value for length.
Yeah, and you increase your odds, your percentages of being able to get it correct. So you may not get it, but you went from a 10% chance to a 50% chance just because you didn't give up and you actually stopped and thought about it and gave yourself a higher chance to get it right.
And quizzers need to develop that. That's why when they just give up on it, quote the verse of Mark chapter 1 naming, and they just sit there, it's just like, goodness, like, say something. Come on. It's exactly right.
It's like don't say baseball adage, right? The only way to make sure you don't hit it is to not swing.
Right.
Swing just in case you hit it.
Right. Exactly. What makes me even more mad is I've had a kid just kind of like mumble the question and be like, remember the name for a minute and just like, because they think they're wrong. And they would have been right. Like they actually got it right, but they just like mumbled through it and just like, well, just like put it down. And it's just like, you would have got
Philip,
it right.
We've got maybe 15, 20 minutes left. Do you want to skip through to some other types or do you want to keep going straight through?
The only thing I want to point about this one was statement. This is just another punctuation thing. Quote the statement of Mark chapter 15, naming 3 women. That's another thing to notice. If your kids don't know that Salome is a woman, then that's important to know, right? Like, who was Salome? And it's she's only in a couple verses. What if they think that's a guy? What if they think that's a man? Then they really have struggle with the question like this. This is actually the question that got us to nationals this year, so I just had to put it in here. It was it was tough.
And we had a quizzer last year that thought that there were actually another person named here: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Mary the mother of Joseph, and Salome, because they didn't understand the punctuation there necessarily.
Right.
So that's another thing. You got to make sure that everybody understands exactly what's going on here in this verse.
Okay. Okay, this is another one. You're probably going to see this a lot this year. Quote the two verses following the one in which something. Why are we going to see that a lot this year? Because verses are so short. You have to put verses together to make some decent quotation questions.
Especially,
I know I've written a lot.
Especially 30s.
Yeah, especially 30s. You're going to be quoting a lot of multiple
and
verses
cross references.
Quote what
See a lot of
Peter
cross-reference
said,
quotations.
naming Moses. This is just another one of those spoken words. We're not going to see a lot of this year, but this is just another style of this. We had to know where their speaking begins and where their speaking ends. Sometimes what they said can cross verses, right? We had and if you say that this came out of 9:5 and 9:6, what he said, and you say, quote what Peter said, naming Moses in verse 5 of Mark chapter 9. When the question actually really wanted 5 and 6, that's when narrowing it down can be a problem. This is obviously.
But again, if you hear it quote what Peter said, you have to understand at that point that we're now not dealing with verse parameters on this thing.
Right.
We're dealing with context parameters, punctuation parameters, and that's
Yes.
again a huge key for senior quizzing.
Yep. All right, we're done with quotations. 20-point directs. This is a fun one. Peter called to mind what? Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said unto him. And then what that word is. I like this question. Called to mind is unique. What more do we need? Once again, 20-point direct. What do we know? We're going to have a long answer. It's going to be one question, one answer, and it's going to be long. That's what I tell my kids. You already know. And then Peter called. That's unique. Why did they need any more? Called to mind what? The word that Jesus said unto him, all that stuff. That's just kind of a context question. They had to understand what he called to mind. You take this one.
In reply to the question, is it I? Jesus answered and said, what?
So this is one thing I want to point
I
out
haven't
on
seen
this.
this one. I didn't look at this.
Okay,
one.
sorry. This is an example of reply versus response.
Yeah, exactly right.
This is what I wanted to point out here. So a reply is a spoken answer. Okay. A response can include actions. How did the disciples respond in the verse in which they saw Jesus walking on water? Right? It includes actions, right? They were sore afraid. That was their response, maybe, right? That might not be exactly right, but that response versus reply, where we miss questions because we use the wrong word in these cases, reply versus response.
Well, even in this question, you could make the argument there's a difference here in reply versus response. If the question was in response to the question, is it I, you would likely have to include, and he answered and said unto them, as part of your answer. Whereas the way that it's asked, that's not something that you have to necessarily include, because the reply is just the spoken words.
Which in this case, it's at the beginning, so you're not going to mix it up.
Yeah, you're not going to mix it up.
That is a good point. Yes. All right. And okay, sorry. Last thing about this one, you have to see there's no verse references on this. And if you narrowed it down in this case, you'd be in trouble. So this is where I have to kind of walk back what I said about good habits of narrowing stuff down. There are cases, and the quizzers need to be aware of these situations where if they narrow this down to a single verse, they get it wrong. So this is one of those context things where they need to know, in reply to that question, Jesus said all of this. And it's very doubtful that they're going to take only part of his reply to that question, right? They're going to want the whole reply. So they need to understand that in reply to this question, Jesus said all of this. All right. To what request do Jesus' words, ye know not what ye ask, This is a tough one for senior quizzers. These whole things, and Brother Faubert likes these. To what does this refer? So like you see a lot of like in the verse preceding the one that says, therefore they went their way. To what does this refer? Well, that therefore is referring to like, because this stuff happened, therefore this happened. But what's that's referring to? What is that therefore referring to? Something in the previous verse. So in this case, to what request do Jesus' words, ye know not what ye ask, refer? So this is kind of a more unique one, but this is something that quizzers struggle with. Knowing that ye know not what ye ask, what is that referring to? He's referring to what the disciples asked him, right? And what did they ask him? And this is one of those context things that we need to talk through. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you.
Anything to add?
No. I mean, the only thing I would add to it is that I see a lot of times kids, and this is sort of off the topic, but it's included. They struggle with how to finish these questions. They know what the question is, they know what the answer is, but they just can't find the words to finish it. Right. And you see them sit there for 15 or 20 seconds trying to think about what do I say?
Right.
And I just always try to tell them, just don't overthink it. Make it simple. This is simple. To what do these words refer?
But if your kids struggle with stuff like this, then you
work on it.
You work on these. Okay. You yourself as a coach, try and maybe write 10 of them yourself. It helps yourself to write 10 of these things with where they.
I had a quizzer that was just extremely intelligent, very, very good quizzer, but he struggled with wanting to answer it perfectly in just the right way and would waste 20 seconds of his time trying to figure out exactly the proper way to word the question when really essence wise, pretty much anything would work.
Right. All right, let's go. Jesus said that what signs shall follow. Okay, Jesus said that what signs unique, what signs shall follow them that believe. This is one of those, we had to know what the signs are. Just as kids knowing the material, this is obviously a hugely popular section of verses. Yep. There's no need to wait. What signs? You don't need any more than that. All right. When Jesus was gone forth into the way. So this is one of these things that was common, especially in the doctrine. It gives you a when, and that when helps you locate it. So what's on the other side of these questions where a when is given? There's two ways it could go most likely on these directs. It gives you a when, what happened, or when Jesus was gone forth in the way, Jesus did what, or a man did what. That's basically the only two ways it could go. And this was honestly something that we struggled with this past year, figuring out when it was what happened versus this person did what. And a lot of that has to do with the context of the verse. Is it one person doing all this stuff at this time, this when that was given in the question? Or is it multiple things happening and someone did what isn't going to work in this case? Okay. All clear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We're getting close.
3 more. 4 more.
In the verse following the one in which Jesus said, bring him unto me. So, okay. Some of these questions sound like in the verse following the one that says, sometimes it's and the question is long and drawn out, and the quizzers want to just give a piece of it and then just go to the answer, right? Let's say that said, bring them unto me, and a little more added to it. But the quizzer only said, bring them unto me. What happened? You got to teach your quizzers to finish the thought.
Finish it. Take it all the way to the end.
Take it all the way to the end of the phrase, all the way to the end of the verse, perhaps, and then go to that what happened. Yeah. So you just had to get it to the point. At what point does a quizzer have everything in the verse following the one that Jesus said, bring him? That's all they need. All they need to do is finish the thought. What's going on in the next verse? Something happened in response as a result of bring him unto me. And this is a thing where is it a what resulted or a what happened? Yeah. They brought him unto him and we saw him straight away. You could say that in essence.
The other thing that it could be, it's not here, but what trigger word? It could be a why. Because you got to know what those trigger words are and what the differences are.
That's another style of these in the verse. Find the one in which this happened. Why? If that next verse is the why to whatever is in the question that was given. So only a couple ways this can go, and you just had to make sure your kids are aware of this style and how to handle these. Mark chapter 9, verses 30 and 31 record that they departed thence and passed through Galilee, and he would not that any man should know it. Why? Some quizzes really struggle with this. Why? Because that's a lot of words in the question, right? So some quizzers want to say Mark chapter 9, verse 30, record that they departed thence and passed through Galilee. Why? Okay. What does that do? That kind of that introduces subjectivity, right? Now the quiz master is trying to figure out, oh, does he need and he would not that any man should know it? What do we want to do? Finish the thought, get all the way to the why. And I mean, just based on this being a 20-point direct question, you need to be aware that there's a long why right here. That's going to be it. You had to hone into the long why.
I would argue that you could even erupt a little sooner on this because you've got a lot of information because you know it's a 20-point direct, especially if this was a 30. But even as a 20, you got a 20-point direct that's from multiple verses. So likely this is going to be something in the second verse that is describing or is a why or is a what happened or is a what resulted to something in the first verse. And that's going to be evident in the verses. You're probably going to be able to look at those two verses and determine if it's a why, if it's a what resulted, whatever it is. And so really, if you have a really good quizzer, that's a high cognitive quizzer, that is very good material command, you could probably hit this again if you're wanting to be a little more aggressive after the verse reference. Mark chapter 9, verses 30 and 31 record. At that point, it's going to be something like this. And there's only going to be so many high percentage choices that the verses are going to present to you.
There's only so many long answers to questions, right? Like you have to come up with a question that has a really long answer. There's only so many ways
And this
that can
one
be,
is,
right?
this one, I feel like any high level quizzer is going to get this question if you give a Mark chapter 9, verses 30 and 31 record. I just feel like they are because it's obvious. There's that why, the why in the second verse to the what is in the first verse.
Right.
And most of the time they lay out that way.
We're going to do two more. According to verses 26 and 27, Mark chapter 4, how? Okay. We had to know how. That how is almost always paired with describe. How is this described, especially in these directs? So we need to know, so is the kingdom of God, as if all of this is describing the kingdom of God. Descriptions, or we just have to be on top of that and notice and take note of that stuff. Oh, look, all of this is a description of the kingdom of God. That's a good question.
And again, I make the same argument for this question that I did for the last one. You could probably hit it after chapter 4.
Right. You have to,
because you're going to get how.
There's only so many questions that can have a big answer, right? There's only so many ways. And it's going to be a why. It's going to be a how is it described? Is a what results? Is a said what? I mean, there's only so many, right? There's only so many that it could be. And if your quizzers can just go through each of the things that it could possibly be, they're going to figure out which one.
And this is a good example of showing them the difference between being aggressive and patient, right? There's a difference here. This is how you can illustrate. Okay, when I say be aggressive, this is what I mean. You can probably figure this out after chapter 4. You definitely should be able to figure this out after how is the kingdom.
Right.
And so that's a good way to illustrate that difference of when I say be patient, I'm looking for this. When I say be aggressive, I'm looking for this. On a 30-point question, if we have to have it to win, if it's a direct question, I want them to hit after the reference. If it starts according to verses 25, 26, and 27 of Mark chapter 2, I want them to hit there. Because again, that the length of the answer is going to such limit the questions that can be asked out of those verses. It's going to, a good high level cognitive quizzer is going to be able to find the high percentage option of questions.
You had to find the thread between the three verses that combine them for one, where
what is described, what question, what 3 consecutive questions.
What did Jesus say?
What did Jesus say?
You know, anything like there's only a few things that it could be.
And it will present itself to an astute high level quizzer.
All right. Last one here. How did his disciples respond? I think this is why I put this one in here, where you're talking about the response versus the reply. How did his disciples respond when they saw Jesus walking upon the sea? they suppose it had been a spirit and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. Did they say anything? They didn't say, I mean, they cried out, but they didn't say anything. Their responses include actions and any spoken words. So that I just want to make that clear, because that's something that we struggled with at times and got mixed up. So, all right, and that's it for 20-point directs. I think at this point we're gonna call it. We've had a long day. Darren and I.
They've had a long day.
Yeah, I could keep going, but I don't think that's a good idea. So at this point, I think we're gonna call it, and we're gonna kind of sum everything up for a few minutes and cut off at 4. But Darren and I are gonna plan on just finishing this up in a video, just the two of us, and you can watch it to your heart's content if you want to. If you feel like you get the gist of what we're trying to do here, really,
a lot of it you'll be able to get just from the slides themselves.
Really, you know, and the point is you need to be able to look at questions and break them down and see things that you can show your kids on. Hey, there's only so many ways it could go if you get this. Hey, did you notice you had this? Just trying to break it down that way and give your kids an advantage to see certain things, especially if you notice that they are struggling on understanding the words to say on this type of question, right? Just going through and trying to help them understand and get comfortable with those certain types of things. So all in all, I'm gonna skip to the end here. So we had a lot more.